Good day again, everyone. So, welcome to our 8th week of Nursing Leadership and Management lecture. In this lecture, we are stepping away from the direct bedside for a moment. We're going to look at the machinery that keeps the units running. We have here the strategic planning, budgeting, resource allocation, and time management. So when you transition into becoming leaders or nurse managers, you focus on building your confidence, which means mastering these systems. The budgeting, the planning, the budgeting, the resource allocation, and time management. Remember, professional nursing practice is not just about clinical competency, but it is heavily bounded by jurisprudence or law and administrative accountability. If you cannot run a unit efficiently or manage its money or finances, you cannot guarantee patient safety. Period. Okay? So let's discuss about it further. Let's say, okay, I want you to think of an ICU nurse who is very good or brilliant in managing a dying or problematic patient, but completely lost when asked to justify why is there a need for additional pulse oximeters. Now, this lecture will going to bridge that gap. Okay. Let's start with modes and tools for planning. In management, planning is always step number one. You cannot organize, you cannot think of staffing, directing, or control anything until you know what your goals are and what you achieve those things in planning. Planning is simply looking ahead, identifying your destination, and plotting the safest route to be there. In healthcare, we split this into two types. The strategic planning, which looks 3 to 5 years down the line, like a hospital designing to become a certified stroke center. And operational planning, which handles immediate needs like how we are going to manage staffing over the next month. So imagine a hospital expanding the emergency department by 20 beds. An operational plan determines how many syringes, linens, and nurses must be physically present on day one of that opening. While strategic planning will focus on opening the first robotic cath lab in Laguna, which requires state-of-the-art facilities and expert doctors required to complete several courses to be able to legally practice the procedure. There are actually four classic ways organizations handle the future. And let's look at how this show up in nursing. First, we have the reactive planning. This is what we call the firefighting. You wait for a crisis to hit or to be present, and then you react. Next is inactivism, where management actively resists change, keeping things exactly as they are, even if they are no longer appropriate or can no longer be used. Then we have the pre-activism, which uses forecasting to prepare for a highly probable future. Proactive planning is also referred to in management as pre-activism. This is an approach where a leader uses data, historical trends, and forecasting to anticipate future needs and changes before they actually happen. So instead of waiting for a problem to explode and then scrambling to fix it, which is actually is reactive planning. A proactive nurse manager looks ahead, prepares the unit, and puts systems in place so that when the future arrives, the team is completely ready. There are three core elements of proactive planning. We have the forecasting or looking for trends, so you don't guess what will happen. You look at historical data or seasonal patterns and upcoming changes. And then the next element is early resource allocation. So here, you secure staff, equipment, or training ahead of time so there is no shortage when the demand is present. And then we have the risk mitigation, where you identify potential failure points in daily operations and design workflows to prevent them from causing harm. But our golden standard actually is interactivism or interactive planning. This is where we do not just wait for the future, but we actively shape it by collaborating with our staff and using evidence-based data to redesign our workflows before the things break down or before uh, problems occur. Okay, let us differentiate reactive versus interactive. Okay, when we say reactive, a unit experiences massive nurse turnover, and only then does the manager scramble to offer retention bonuses or hire expensive agency nurses. While interactive is where a manager notices local competitor hospitals who are raising or increasing wages, sits down with staff to discuss satisfaction, and then works with HR to adjust career ladders before anyone resigns. Now, let's talk about execution. It is one thing to say we are going to be proactive and interactive planners, but how do we actually do that without getting overwhelmed by the moving parts or by the resignations? We use objective, evidence-based managerial tools. Okay, let's break down four essential planning tools that every nurse leader must master. We have the Gantt charts, the PERT and CPM, the decision trees, and the SWOT analysis. Let us first discuss the Gantt chart. Think of a Gantt chart as a highly visual horizontal calendar or timeline for a project. On the left side, you list the tasks that needs to be done. Across the top, you map out time, or days, or weeks, or months. Bar lines will show exactly when each task will start, how long it takes, and who is responsible for it. And it keeps the entire team aligned so no one is guessing what will happen next because everyone is guided. Imagine your hospital transitioning your ward from paper charts to a new electronic health record or EHR system. You do not just turn the computers on and hope for the best. You use Gantt chart. So week 1 is hardware installation. Week 2 and 3 will be for classroom training for the staff. Week 4 is the go live phase where super users are on the floor. If a nurse manager sees that hardware installation is not yet done into third week or week 3, the chart immediately alerts them that staff training will be delayed. Next, we have the PERT, which stands for Program Evaluation and Review Technique, and CPM, which stands for Critical Path Method. These are network diagrams. They look like a web of arrows connecting different circles. These two, the PERT and the CPM, do something brilliant. They map out task interdependencies. They tell you which task can happen at the same time and which task must wait for the previous one to finish. CPM explicitly identify the critical path, the absolute longest sequence of mandatory tasks. If any task on that critical path is delayed by even just one day, the entire project launch will become delayed. This tells you as managers exactly where they need to focus their energy to prevent the bottlenecks. Okay, let's say you are opening a brand new expanded hemodialysis unit and you have multiple parallel tracks. Track A is renovating the physical space and installing the water purification system. Track B is hiring and credentialing the specialized dialysis nurses. Now, you cannot clinically train the nurse on the machines until the machines are installed and calibrated. This CPM maps out this dependency. If the contractor will be delayed or delays the water system installation by 2 weeks, your CPM chart tells you immediately that your grand opening date is pushed backward, allowing you to adjust your staffing contracts before wasting money on idle labor. Our third tool is Decision Tree. This is a quantitative, logic-based tool that looks like it sounds, a tree with branches. It starts with a core decision and then branches out into different choices, chance events, and their potential outcomes, including financial cost, legal risk, or staffing impacts. It strips emotion out of tough administrative dilemmas and forces you to look at the statistical probability of success versus failure. Okay, let's say as a nurse manager, you are facing a severe weekend staffing shortage. So you draw a decision tree to look at your options. Branch 1, approve mandatory overtime for your current staff. The outcome? High cost, high risk of nurse burnout, but guaranteed clinical coverage. Branch 2, hire external agency or agency for nurses. The outcome? Even higher financial cost and a potential risk to patient safety because agency nurses do not know your area's specific protocols. While branch 3, divert incoming non-emergency admission. The outcome? Zero extra cost, but a massive loss in hospital revenue and potential friction with the medical director. The decision tree allows you to weigh the financial, legal, and operational costs of each branch side by side to make and provide you the safest choice and decision. And then lastly, we have the SWOT. This is the very classic SWOT analysis. So this is your environmental scanning tool that's split into a 2x2 grid. It forces you to look internally at your area's strength and weakness and externally at the market's opportunity and threats. Okay. It was also highlighted that aligning your unit's strengths with the broader regulatory and legal landscape is a key requirement of professional governance. So you use a SWOT analysis whenever you want to pitch a new initiative or sees where your unit stands competitively. Okay, let's move into fiscal planning and healthcare budgeting. I know that by this time, some of you are thinking, I went into nursing to take care of people and not look at spreadsheets. So that's accounting job for us. Here is the reality check. Nursing services account for roughly 50 to 60 of the entire hospital's operating budget. we are actually the biggest in terms of population in the hospital. We are the largest labor force in the building or in the hospital. If you want to advocate for your patient and your staff when you become leaders, you must speak the language of money. Financial literacy is a form of patient advocacy. And if you cannot read a budget sheet, you cannot effectively ask for the resources that your area or your unit needs to stay safe. Okay. Example, a nurse manager goes to the chief nursing officer asking or requesting for additional staff because the team is already experiencing burnout or they are already tired. Then the request is denied. The second manager goes in with data showing that patient acuity went up by 15%, causing a 20% spike in overtime cost, and demonstrates that hiring one full-time nurse will actually save the hospital money. Now, among the two, who do you think will be granted? Or which request do you think will be approved? You are correct. It's the second manager. Let's move into the myth of fiscal planning. If you are going to open a hospital's financial ledger, you will see hundreds of line items. A nurse manager or your world is primarily divided into three major buckets: the personal budget, the operating budget, and the capital budget. Understanding how these three interact is exactly how you keep your unit moving without draining hospital resources. So let's start with the largest, the heaviest bucket. This is the personal budget, also known as the manpower or labor budget. As we discussed earlier, nursing is a labor-intensive service. This budget covers the salaries of your full-time and part-time staff, their healthcare benefits, retirement contributions, and shift differentials like night shift premiums and paid leaves. What makes the personal budget so incredibly difficult to manage is its volatility. It changes constantly based on patient volume and acuity. If the unit or the area experiences sudden staff turnover, or if a flu outbreak hits your own nursing staff, your personnel budget takes a massive hit because you have to pay overtime to the remaining staff or even hire high-cost registry nurses to maintain safe nurse-to-patient ratio. Imagine you run a 30-bed medical surgical ward. Your personnel budget is built assuming you have 15 full-time staff nurses working standard shifts. Suddenly, 3 nurses go on maternity leave at the same time, and 2 resign to work abroad. To keep the floor safe, you have to ask your remaining nurses to work consecutive 12-hour shifts at an overtime rate of 125 or 130% of their basic pay. So at the end of the month, your financial report will show a massive negative variance in your personnel budget. So as a manager, you have to defend that expenditure by proving it was clinically necessary to prevent patient abandonment or medication errors. The second bucket is the operating budget. Think of this as the daily cost of doing business. It reflects the expenses for short-term consumable supplies required to provide direct patient care. We are talking about medical surgical supplies like syringes, IV catheters, yung mga gauze, saline flashes, yung mga linen, PPE, and even the printer paper and pens at the nursing station. The operating budget is heavily tied to the concept of preventable waste. If your staff is careless with supplies, your operating budget will bleed out rapidly or it will increase. So let's say a staff nurse is getting ready to insert a peripheral IV line. Instead of just taking one IV catheter inside the patient's room, they grab three, okay, just in case. They successfully insert the line on the first try. But because the other two catheters were brought into a contact isolation room, they cannot be returned to the clean utility supply, so they get thrown in the trash can. Imagine if every nurse on a 30-bed unit wastes 2 IV catheters a day. That will add up to thousands of pesos of pure loss every single week. And that loss is tracked directly as an operational budget overrun. And it's the nurse manager's job to educate the staff on cost-conscious clinical practice. Then we have the third one, the capital budget. This is completely separate from your daily operational cost. Capital budgets are used for long-term investments in high-value physical assets. To qualify as a capital expenditure, an item must meet two institutional criteria. First, it must cost more than a specific monetary threshold set by the hospital management, and it must have an expected lifespan of greater than 1 year. Because these items are expensive, they require a formal proposal and approval process. So you don't just order them on a whim. You usually have to justify how buying this equipment will either generate revenue, reduce long-term costs, or drastically improve patient outcomes. So let's say the old mechanical ventilators in the ICU are continuously malfunctioning and costing the hospital massive amount of money in frequent maintenance. Now, if you are the ICU manager, you can submit a capital budget request to purchase 3 new state-of-the-art ventilators. But you have to write a proposal showing that while the upfront cost is high, these new machines will reduce patient ventilator days by 15%, lower repair costs to zero for the next 3 years, and eliminate the risk of equipment failure during the very critical patient hold. That is a classic capital budget negotiations. Okay. Now, let's tackle one of the most critical concepts in modern healthcare economics, how we actually build our budgets and how we prove that nursing care is worth it. When you sit down with the finance department or finance manager to build your annual unit budget, you will actually see two opposing methods. The first is the incremental budgeting. This is the traditional historical approach because the finance department will look at what your unit spent last year and they will just simply add a flat rate of say 3 to 5% to account for inflation or a slight increase in patient volume. It's incredibly simple and fast, which is why hospitals love it. But it has a massive flaw because it assumes that every peso you spent last year was spent perfectly. It hides wastage. It ignores inefficiency and it encourages a spend it or lose it mentality among managers who are terrified that if they don't exhaust their funds by December, their budget will be slashed next year. So imagine your medical ward that spent 2 million on medical supplies last year. Under an incremental model, the hospital will give you an additional of 80,000 for the 3 to 5% increment for the following year or for the incoming year. But the problem is nobody checks to see that actually the 100,000 of that money was actually wasted on expired stocks that sat at the back of the clean utility room. The waste just gets rolled over into the incoming year. The complete opposite of this is zero-based budgeting. With this method, you don't look at the last year at all. Every single fiscal cycle begins at a baseline of absolute zero. That's why it's called zero-based budgeting. So as a nurse manager, you have to justify every single nurse position, every package of dressing, and every syringe from scratch, proving exactly how it directly connects to patient outcomes and your current area needs. While it is very time consuming and heavy on paperwork, it is a very good way to count out absolute or obsolete practices and eliminate hidden, unforeseen wastage. So, let's say you are running an outpatient surgical clinic and you want to justify keeping for example, your full-time nurses, your 8 full-time nurses. You cannot say that, well, we had 8 last year. Under zero-based budgeting, you must present your current patient intake data, showing that you expect 400 surgeries this year, or that based on clinical guidelines, those 400 surgeries require exactly 16 hours of direct nursing care. So you justify the position from scratch based on actual data. This brings us directly to the concept of costing out nursing service. For years, for decades, for generations, hospitals treat nursing care as an overhead cost. Alam niyo yun? When a patient got their bill, nursing salaries were hidden inside the generic area of room and board rate, or they are uh, incorporated right next to the laundry or electricity or sometimes dietary meals, because this was the standard practice. However, it created a dangerous narrative. It made us look like a massive financial drain, a pure cost center rather than a professional service that generates revenue. So to change this, modern healthcare management must use patient classification system, or the PCS, to isolate and cost out nursing. A PCS categorizes patients based on their actual acuity and nursing dependencies, and that will become the basis on the uh, salaries for nurses. So let's look at two patients side by side. For example, in ICU. So you see how a patient classification system works in the ward and in the ICU. So patient A is an alert, stable, post-operative patient who can walk, who can eat by themselves or eat independently, and who is just waiting for discharge instruction. So under the PCS, this will be categorized as category 1 or self-care, requiring maybe mga 2 hours of nursing care per day. However, Patient B in the ICU room is a multi-organ failure patient on a ventilator, requiring continuous vital sign monitoring, complex dressing changes, and multiple titrable IV medication pumps. So the PCS flags them as category 3 or 4 or under intensive care, which require continuous 12 to 18 hours of nursing care per day. So, if you are the manager or the nurse manager in the hospital, they charge both patient exact same room and board rate. Patient A is heavily subsidizing the massive amount of nursing time consumed by patient B. By using the PCS, we can calculate the relative value unit or the RVU. We multiply those specific hours of care by the actual hourly wage of the nurse providing it. This allows you and the hospital to formulate or to compute the bill accurately. But more importantly, it allows you as nurse manager to prove to the board of directors or to the administrators that when an intensive care patient successfully avoids a deadly complication, it wasn't the room that saved them, but it was the direct quantifiable investment of the 12 to 18 hours of highly skilled nursing care. So it transforms nursing from a hidden overhead expense into an explicit value-driven clinical asset. Let's move on to look at the broader macroeconomic picture, which is the healthcare financing and cost effectiveness. We have talked about how money moves inside and out of the hospital or in your unit or in the area. Now, we need to talk about how money moves into the hospital from the outside and how national policy dictates our daily choices at the bedside. So, as nurse managers, practicing in our local context, we cannot discuss healthcare financing without grounding ourselves in the Universal Healthcare Act or the UHC Act, which is the ultimate objective of the UHC Act, that is to ensure that every single citizen has equitable access to quality healthcare without facing financial problem. And to achieve this, the law shifted the burden away from out-of-pocket spending and positioned PhilHealth, which is our National Health Insurance Program, as the primary institutional gatekeeper and single purchaser of healthcare services. Okay. So what does this mean? For hospital management, it means PhilHealth is shifting away from historical fee-for-service models where hospitals could bill endlessly for every single itemized gauze, medicines, etc. to moving towards prospective payment systems and global budget allocation. So the government says we will pay a fixed predetermined amount for this specific medical condition. So if a patient's care exceeds that budget because of the staff inefficiencies or preventable complications, the hospital will absorb the loss. This is where our role as manager becomes very important. So, let's look at a concrete example. PhilHealth provides a fixed case rate package for a standard uncomplicated cesarean section. This package is designed to cover a specific number of hospital days routine medications, and standard nursing care. So if your post-op ward suffers from poor operational planning and a patient's discharge is delayed by 2 days simply because the resident's paperwork was lost or a routine lab test wasn't done on schedule, those extra 2 days of room, board, and nursing care cannot be billed anymore to PhilHealth, nor can they be passed on to the patient under the no balance billing policy for vulnerable sectors. The hospital takes a direct financial loss. So as a nurse manager, ensuring smooth, highly efficient clinical pathway is not just about administrative speed, but it is a legal and financial imperative to keep the hospital moving efficiently and effectively. These realities bring us directly to the concept of cost effectiveness. So let me pause here and emphasize this heavily, because this is where many young nurses get confused. Cost effectiveness is different and is totally not cost cutting. It does not mean buying the cheapest, lowest quality syringes or supplies or intentionally understaffing a shift to save money. That is what we call cheap care. And cheap care is incredibly expensive in the long run because it can cause medical errors, cross-contaminations, and even the worst, lawsuits. Cost effectiveness is an analytical comparison. It measures the financial cost of an intervention against the actual clinical outcomes it produces. An intervention is cost effective if it achieves the absolute best health outcomes per peso spent. Sometimes, the most cost-effective choice is actually the more expensive one up front because it completely eliminates massive compounding expenses down the line. Okay. Let's look at the classic bedside dilemma. Suppose your hospital or the hospital where you will be working is looking at two types of central venous catheter dressing kits. Kit A uses a standard cheap transparent dressing and costs 150, while Kit B includes an advanced chlorhexidine impregnated gel pad that continuously releases antimicrobial agents, however costs 800. If a purely reactionary manager looks only at the line item, you will choose kit A, di ba? To save 650. But a cost-effective nurse looks at the data. The data shows that kit B reduces central line associated bloodstream infection or CLABIS by 60%. So if a single patient develops a CLABSI on your unit or in your area, it requires extended ICU stay, broad-spectrum IV antibiotics, multiple blood cultures, and advanced life support, costing the hospital or the health system upward by, let's say lang, 150 to 200,000 in uncompensated care because no one is going to pay for this under the no balance billing of PhilHealth ruling. So by spending the extra 650 upfront on Kit B, you prevent a multi-hundred thousand pesos disaster. That is the exact mathematical definition of cost effectiveness in nursing leadership. You spend your budget deliberately on evidence-based prevention to protect both the patient's life and your hospital or the institution's capital. Remember, okay, under nursing ethics and jurisprudence, we nurses have legal and ethical duty to utilize societal and institutional resources wisely. So when you see a colleague or a coworker wasting supplies or letting clinical care stall or become inefficient, ineffective, they are not just wasting time, but they are directly threatening the financial net that allows the hospital to treat the next poor patient who walks through the emergency room. So let's carry this mindset into our final module, managing our most precious non-renewable resources, which is our time. Now let's talk resource and time management. We've talked about tangible resources, money, supplies, and equipment because we see these things. Now, we're going to look at the most precious, completely non-renewable resource that we have, the time. You can request an increase in your operational budget and you can buy more syringes, but you can never buy a single extra minute on a chaotic shift. In high acuity clinical settings, poor time management is not just an administrative inconvenience that makes us go home late. It is a structural failure that directly compromises patient safety. Okay. When nurses lose control over their time, their cognitive load skyrockets. It shifts very high. This leads to profound mental fatigue and anxiety. And when a nurse is working in a state of constant panic because they are behind, we see a drastic spike in what we call missed nursing care. This means routine but vital clinical interventions starts to become or to get skipped. Turning protocols are forgotten, skin assessments are rushed, and medication charting errors multiply. Time management is the invisible framework that holds clinical competence together. Imagine a shift where a nurse fails to plan their morning. They get caught up in unstructured socializing or chasing down misplaced charts. By 10 a.m., they are running to give 9 a.m. medications to 6 different patients because they are in a desperate rush. They skip the mandatory patient identity band check on the last patient and administer a high alert antihypertensive medication to the wrong person. Now, this medication error did not happen because the nurse lacked clinical knowledge. It happened because a total breakdown in the time management forced them in a high-risk rush behavior. To master time on a busy clinical unit, we have to look at it through three distinct operational lenses: the personal, the managerial, and organizational time management. Personal time management is your individual daily shift discipline. It's your internal rhythm. It means arriving 15 minutes before your shift to review your patient charts, setting up physical shift planner, and eliminating personal distractions like constantly checking your phone at the nurse's station. Okay? Managerial time management is how you, as a leader, optimizes the collective hours of the entire unit team. This is centered heavily on the art of clinical delegation. Okay? Under nursing law or nursing jurisprudence, when you become a manager, you must delegate tasks based on the legal scope of practice of your team members. So if a manager fails to delegate routine tasks to nursing aides or nursing assistants, the professional nurses become bogged down in non-nursing duties, causing the entire clinical workflow to become delayed or stalled. Then finally, we have the organizational time management, which involves system-wide structural protocols designed by the institution to completely eliminate communication delays and operational waste. Let's look at a structural example of organizational time management. Consider the traditional unstructured shift handover. And without a system, Nurse A stands at the bedside and talks for 20 minutes about a patient's personality, their family conflicts, and random medical history from 5 years ago. Multiply that by 10 patients, and handover takes nearly 2 hours of pure, unorganized chat or chit-chat. So to fix this, the unit must enforce SBAR or SBAR, which stands for Situation Background Assessment Recommendation. So this is a communication tool. Now, the handover or the endorsement will become structured, standardized, and strictly focused on immediate clinical priorities. The shift report drops from 20 minutes per patient to less than 3 minutes. That will give a free up hours of collective nursing time across the entire hospital. So, moving forward, it's one thing to say, I want to be more efficient, but it is another thing to have an actual operational strategy. So let's look at 4 concrete tools that separate the firefighters, those who are constantly overwhelmed, from the true nursing leaders who manage their shift with precision and calmness. First is the Eisenhower matrix, separating urgent from important. So we often confuse urgency with importance. If you treat every request as an emergency, you will never get to the work that actually prevents crisis. The Eisenhower matrix is your filter. Okay, because here, quadrant 1 is for urgent and important. These are your do now tasks. A patient in respiratory distress, a medication error, a hemorrhage, and you cannot plan for this, so you must act. Quadrant 2 is what we call the important but not urgent. This is the leadership zone. It includes patient education, long-term care planning, and preparing your area protocols. So if you spend time here, you actually prevent quadrant 1 crisis from happening. Most nurses neglect this, which is why their shift feels like a never-ending cycle of emergencies. Quadrant 3 is called urgent but not important. These are interruptions, a phone call that could have been an email or a minor administrative request. These actually steal your time. Your goal is to delegate this or set boundaries. Quadrant 4 is called not urgent and not important. These are time wasters. You need to avoid them entirely. A manager who spends their shift in quadrant 2, updating protocols and teaching staff, has fewer quadrant 1 crises, which is patient safety events, that requires fixing later. The next one is the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule. In nursing management, The Pareto principle suggests that 80% of your area or patient or your unit's patient safety and quality outcome are driven by just 20% of your activities. So, if you have a list of 10 tasks, stop and ask yourself first, which two tasks here will have the greatest impact on patient safety? Maybe it's the shift handoff and the high alert medication double check. Focus your mental energy there. Don't waste your peak cognitive hours on the 80% of tasks like non-essential thirting or restocking linens that have minimal impact on patient survival or recovery. Optimize the vital few, not the trivial many. Next, we have the effective delegation or the 5 R's, the 5 rights. You cannot optimize time if you are doing everything yourself. Effective delegation is not dumping work on others. It is a leadership skill that maximizes your area's total capacity. Use the 5 R's of delegation to ensure safety and legal compliance. The right task, okay, will answer the question, is this within the scope of practice? So don't ask a nursing attendant to perform an assessment because they are not licensed or they are not educated to do that. Right circumstances will ask the question, is the patient stable? The right person will answer the question, does this person have the skill set? The right direction or communication will answer the question, did you give clear, concise instruction? Do not just say check on him, but rather say get a blood pressure, check the IV line site for infiltration, and let me know if the systolic is under 100. The right supervision will ask, did you follow up? Okay? The leadership truth is that if you try to perform tasks that your subordinate are licensed to do, you are actually bottlenecking the unit's workflow. You are not being a good teammate. You are failing to lead. Next is eliminating time wasters or the shadow work. So let's talk about the shadow work. Those invisible tasks that eat away at your shift or your duty. Okay. First is the equipment hunting. This is the number one time waster in us or in our profession in nursing. If in your area, you constantly hunt for pulse oximeters, you have a broken system. So you need to optimize your supply chain. Next is the communication loops. Use standardized tools like the SBAR. If you have to ask a question 4 times because the answer was vague, you have wasted time. So with this, you need to demand clarity. Another is interruptions. Create no interruption zone for high-stakes tasks like medication preparation. A nurse interrupted while calculating a pediatric dose is a nurse who is about to make a medication error. So what's our takeaway? Optimization is not about working faster. It is about removing the friction that slows down your clinical practice. When you clear the shadow work, you give your nurses back the time to do what they were actually trained for caring for the patient. Now, so I would like to give you a case that you can analyze, okay? I'm going to give a scenario about fiscal planning, okay? Suppose in your area, okay, your monthly budget report shows a massive negative financial variance under operating supplies. because nurses are opening entire sterile dressing kits just to use a single pair of gauze. Which budget category is affected and what mode of planning should you use to fix this? Okay. Another scenario is you have a patient who needs an elective discharge teaching session done sometime today, and another patient whose blood pressure just dropped to 80/40. Using Eisenhower matrix, how do you categorize these two? Okay? Now, these are the resources or the image resources that I have used in this lecture. So that concludes our discussion or our 8-week or week 8 topic. So I hope you learned something again from this discussion. Thank you very much again for listening.